Good afternoon, good evening. My name's Corinne, and today I'm so happy you have joined us to talk about building relationships, trust, and getting business done overseas. I'm part of the Learning and Development Committee in TAMS, and it's our goal to ensure we share our experiences and collectively work to keep learning and educating those in our industry. As the world has become a much smaller place with technology advancements in communication, bringing us together, there is still a need for face-to-face interaction. As corporations become more global, there is an opportunity and a need for us to travel overseas to countries we may not have visited before or even know much about how business is done. There are clear differences in our way of life and ways of working based on where you sit in the globe. With the great panelists we have today, we are hoping to share some guidance on how you can be successful and listen to their personal stories as they reminisce on their own learnings. Before we get into our conversation, I would love for our guest speakers to share a little bit about themselves and what great parts of the globe they've called home for many years. First up, Richard Tams.
Hello everyone, my name is Richard Tams. I am talking to you from Sussex, England, but I have lived in a variety of different places around the world, South America, Asia, Scandinavia, and in California as well. So most of that time was spent with British Airways, 27 years, and I now run my own consultancy, Tailwind Advisory, that's very much involved in coaching people in cultural intelligence, which is what we're going to be talking about today.
Great, thanks Richard. Shelley?
Thanks, Corinne. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So I am from the UK originally, but for the past 4 years, I have been living in the beautiful city of Amsterdam. So I'm looking forward to sharing with you some insights on cultural differences between the Brits and the Dutch, which I found fascinating. And in addition to that, over the past 20 years, I've held a variety of roles in marketing, leisure destination, travel, and retail, and worked mainly across Europe, but also touching into the US and some APAC regions. And it's been fascinating for me to understand how different the cultures are and also what we learn when we step away from stereotypes. So I'm really looking forward to sharing some of those insights with you today. And my role as part of TAMS is I'm new to this committee group, this learning group. I support the community and engagement group, and I currently work for Advito, which is the consultancy arm of BCD Travel.
Great, thanks Shelley. Lenore?
Hi, I'm Lenore Danzieri, and I'm a certified social and emotional intelligence and leadership coach. I lived in Japan and in Italy, and I'm from the US. And so I had the opportunity to learn the different cultures as well. Albeit I was born into an Italian American home, but be that as it may, I've spent the last 30 some odd years in the travel industry with the airlines, TMC, some technology companies, and then as a consultant and a coach most recently. But I started my own businesses in Japan, and it was an eye-opener. I'll be sharing some of those stories with you today. And it was really something very different in doing business in Japan than it is here in the US. So I look forward to communicating all of that with you today.
Great, thanks all. So for those of you attending, if you have questions or comments, please post them to the Q&A section versus the chat so we can review as a team and then include in our discussion moving forward. So kicking off, we have a few topics that we're going to cover today, and everyone's going to share their experiences there. So, first up, we're going to talk about building new relationships. We know that it can be difficult enough at times as we are all built so differently, and partnering with a vendor or individual who may not speak the same language or who has different cultural values or beliefs to us really adds another layer. So asking the speakers to really talk about their opinion on what people can do to ensure success here. So Lenore, did you want to kick off?
Sure. Well, I think one of the most important things that I found is to make sure that when you're going to meet with someone from another country, or even, it even applies here domestically. I mean, because we do business in New York differently than we do in California. I think that one of the best things that you can do to make sure that you're successful in reaching your goal, whatever that encounter might be with, is to understand the culture of the location that you're going. understand, how they want you to present, how they like to be spoken to. Are there any physical gestures that you should or should not use? What type of food do they eat? What do they like to talk about? What is their biggest sport? Anything that will help you because trust is big. So anything that will help you to gain their trust. And people love when you ask them questions, or when you share your knowledge about where they've been, or where you've been. So it's very important to be in the know when it comes to dealing with people from other cultures, be it domestically or internationally.
Great, thank you. And Richard, your experience from the airlines, living in Asia, talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first slide you put up, Corinne, was a great one, because if we go into a meeting in another country with a supplier or a customer, potential customer, if you're going in there without the cultural intelligence and without the research that Lenore talked about, you are going in blind. It's what the Finns describe as doing business naked in a sauna. I mean, you really are very vulnerable, and you wouldn't dream of going in to a meeting with people like that without doing research on their company, the company's needs, the company's history, any current news. So why do we tend to go into some of the meetings without doing the cultural research that we should do? So it's a fundamental piece of research that one would do. And I would also say it's very important not to make assumptions as well, because from my experience, some of the biggest cultural faux pas have taken place close to home. So when I was in the mid-90s, I was posted to Scandinavia. And I naively thought that culturally, Scandinavians would be much the same as the British. Or even more naively, I assumed that all Scandinavians would be culturally similar. It's because they were so near that I made that big mistake. So don't make assumptions. Do not assume that people who are geographically near to you may have the same cultural approach to you. And also, I would say, finally, manage your expectations and the expectations of those around you, because things work at different speeds in different cultures. So if you're setting out on a project, a sales project or a procurement exercise, you need to understand that in some cultures, things are going to take a long time. I mean, I was based in Beijing for 3.5 years, and my first 2 years were spent building relationships and pretty well nothing else. And I had to manage my expectations and the expectations of those employing me, that's how long it was going to take. And that's because I did the research.
And to your point about how some things take longer than others, I always think about, when I deal with my stakeholders across, whether it's at McDonald's or different jobs that I've been in, I think it's also their way of life. So if you think about Europe, the Italians, the Spanish, the Greeks, they're pretty laid back. It is what it is. And I think that comes across in the work sometimes, because when you need them for something, I find they are the folks that maybe take a bit longer to get to and get the work done with, because that's just the way they are. And you have to accept that, and you have to plan for that when you're doing what you need to do and gathering information or doing projects with some of these different nationalities and cultures. That's certainly been my experience. And you adapt. Shelley, let's think about your experience.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with that point more. Doing business at their pace, not your pace, is critical. And taking the time to understand and appreciate, and not being afraid to ask as well. I think there's a huge amount that we can do to research beforehand. I would encourage anybody who has to do business with a different country, culture, to find people who have been there before you, find people who have built relationships, who have had that experience. Reach out to this TAMS group. There's a ton of information and wealth of expertise in these groups. But with your research, look at what you can find, lean on people who have been there and done it before, and be prepared to work at their pace, not your pace. Because if you go in with an expectation that you're going to finalize a deal, or you're going to get that contract signed within the standard period that you would ordinarily work with, you're going to be greatly disappointed. And I think, to Richard's point, managing the expectations of your internal stakeholders and those wider contacts within your business to help them understand that there is a cultural difference. That's also a really important part of doing business overseas and with other cultures. It's about doing the business directly, but it's also about that internal relationship and management, and managing those expectations internally that things are going to be different than they may ordinarily be with what you would do as a standard business relationship domestically.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we think about shifting gears a little bit, as I've traveled across the globe, we think about body contact and language and taking cues in meetings. I'm Australian, we are the way we are. And when I go to Asia and meet with someone from Japan, or I meet with someone, I go to Europe and I meet with someone from Germany, it's a different ball game. The way you interact with someone that's from Japan straight up, you may not go and give them a hug and give them a high five. It's just not done. Or the way you hand over a business card to them is very different to how you do it in Europe. So, we have to be very respectful of where these people are from and their personal space and how that's managed. Because as you travel from America to Europe to APAC, there are very clear differences, and you need to be very respectful of people's personal space. So let's talk about body contact, language, and taking cues in meetings. Richard, did you want to kick us off?
Yeah, thanks, Corinne. I think one of the things I'd like to talk about to begin with is a guy called Albert Mehrabian. Now, Albert Mehrabian is an Armenian professor, and he is a bit of a guru in comms circles. And he conducted a series of experiments in the late 1960s, which explored the key components of interpersonal communication. And so he, not surprisingly, said, well, it all depends on the words that we use, the tone of voice, and the body language, the sort of non-verbal communication. And he referred to it as the words, the music, and the dance, which is a really good way of looking at it. And I guess what we're talking about here is the dance, because the dance in certain cultures is a lot more important than the words and the tone of voice. In fact, we know for sure from Mehrabian's research that the dance is always important, and more important in most cases than what people say and the way they say it. But in certain cultures, it's extremely important. Now, at this point, I'm going to also bring in another concept, which is what Erin Mayer in her book, The Culture Map, which is one of the resources we're going to recommend later on. She talks about high context cultures and low context cultures. Now, I'm not going to get too technical here, but high context cultures are cultures that rely a lot on the dance and on the non-verbal cues, on the messaging and the wider context of a conversation. So, for example, Lenore will know from Japan, and I know from my own experience in Korea and China, is that these are very high context cultures. So you cannot judge a response or a reaction based on what they say. You need to take into account a lot more non-verbal indicators. And it's a bit like the Europeans would say talking to the British is like. They never say what they mean. You really have to understand what they're talking about and read between the lines, literally. And so in comparison, you've got the low context cultures where this is commonly seen in Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, in Germany, and in Holland, particularly, Shelley. I know you're going to talk about this. And that's where basically you don't really need so much of the context or the non-verbal cues, because a lot of it is down to what is said. And people in these areas say what they mean and mean what they say. And it's very blunt, it's very to the point, and doesn't require the wider context. So why am I saying all that? I'm just demonstrating that it's extremely important in certain cultures, particularly in the Far East and even parts of Europe, that you look at the non-verbal cues and what people are indicating to you that they might not be saying.
Great, thanks, Richard. Shelley, talk to us about your experience.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that I really wanted to share around this, and it's very much in terms of my experience being very much focused within the UK, Europe, and the US. It is much more about the language in my experience, and particularly in the past 12 months when everybody's had to be virtual. We've all been forced to fall into this world of doing things virtually and the language becoming ever more important. The first example I wanted to share was a client I worked with who was German. She and I had a fantastic relationship. We would speak 3 or 4 times a week. We would go over content that we would be sharing in meetings. We would make sure that everything was set up and ready to go. And she was incredibly supportive, and we had a great working relationship and actually a good personal relationship. We got on well. But every time we had a meeting, and we had a meeting with the global team, so with her manager and her manager's manager, without fail, she would question me on everything that I presented in the meeting. And it left me feeling very unsure of the situation. I didn't understand why she was doing it. I felt that she was trying to trip me up. And I just couldn't quite understand this person who I thought I had a good relationship with, this person who I'd prepped for the meeting with, was throwing questions at me that we never talked about beforehand. And I really couldn't understand it. So when it happened the first time, I let it ride and thought maybe I'd missed something. But then it happened a second time and a third time. And I had to call her. I had to find out what was going on. And I asked her, look, is there a problem? Is there something that I'm not doing right? I really don't understand. I thought that we were prepared. But her feedback to me was she was devastated that I felt the way that I did. And her experience when she was at school, when she was growing up at college and university, she was taught that in order to show that you're engaged in a conversation and that you agree with what's being presented, you should ask a lot of questions. And you should ask difficult questions because you have confidence in the person presenting that they'll be able to answer those questions. So what she was doing was actually trying to put everything across in a very positive light. But from my experience, I felt like I was being thrown under the bus, a very British term, as to just trying to be caught out in what she was doing. And that certainly wasn't her intention. So once we'd had that conversation and I understood that she was going to ask a lot of questions in these environments, it made those meetings much more enjoyable for me and meant that I could be much more productive and give a much better presentation of what I was putting across, because I knew why she was doing it and I knew what to expect.
She was really giving kudos to you because she knew you had it in you, and she was highlighting to everybody how impressed she is with you and the partnership and saying, we've got this.
Exactly. Yeah. And I just wasn't used to that. You know, working in the UK, that's certainly not the way that you would behave. That's certainly not the way that you would expect to handle a meeting situation. So it was very different and surprising for me. And the other thing I wanted to touch on, I think I've got a slide, it might be a couple of slides on, but I just wanted to touch briefly on my experience of moving from the UK to the Netherlands. And everybody, I think without fail, has told me when we were looking at relocating, has told me that, sorry, there's some background noise, I'm sorry for that. Everybody told me the Dutch are direct and you don't need to worry, the Dutch will tell you how it is. And I suppose I listened to that, but didn't necessarily fully appreciate and understand what they meant. And my boss is Dutch, and we have had lots of conversations where he's asked me a very simple question and I've given him a very typical British answer, which meant I've said a lot of words and not really said what I meant, which has meant him coming back to me to say, do you mean yes or do you mean no? So I think this table is really interesting. It's from the Erin Meyer book that Richard just mentioned as well. So definitely a must read for anybody doing business internationally. It's absolutely fascinating. But this table I found really, really fun when I moved to the Netherlands, because I think it's very accurate in terms of what the British say, what we actually mean, and what the Dutch understand. And I think you could replace Dutch with many other cultures. It's not just the Dutch who will perceive what we say in this way. So I thought this was just very interesting and a fun way of looking at it. And hopefully nobody's offended by this, but I think it just sums up that we as Brits in particular use a lot of words and don't necessarily get to the point very quickly.
Nice one. I love
Shelley,
this.
when I was in China, I was always told by my Dutch colleagues within the EU grouping or whatever, that I was much better prepared to talk to the Chinese because I had that British approach than perhaps another Northern European would be, simply because the Chinese as well will say not what they exactly mean. And it's obviously, as I said, it's high context. So they used to laugh at the fact that we're better prepared.
I love it.
I think that's true. And I think because they're our neighbours, so UK to Europe, you expect those similarities, but they are poles apart in terms of communication style. So it's really important, even though they're a close neighbour, to consider the differences.
Yeah.
That's like what I mentioned earlier, going from New York to, and we're unique in and of ourselves, right? And then coming to the South or going out West, geographically, yes, we're on the same continent, but we are very, very different in culturally when doing business. We New Yorkers, I find our culture is, we're a lot more animated than anyone else, and we're very loud and we get right to the point. And that's why a lot of people like New Yorkers get a bad rap, because we're right to the point. We say what we mean what we say. And some people can misconstrue that as us being bossy or arrogant or whatever their perception is. And for me, going from New York, I'm a very animated person. I love using my hands. I make facial expressions. I don't hide my emotions well. And for me, doing business in Japan, I very quickly learned the lesson that that's inappropriate. I sat amongst a table one time of 6 businessmen, and I was proposing, getting in there and teaching English to their employees. And I was speaking like I do now, right? I was using my hands and I was laughing, and everybody else had a straight face on. And it didn't dawn on me until after the meeting that I just came on way too strong. And I didn't take the physical cues from them. I did speak the language, so I was fine there. But I feel in the Asian culture, more so than here, to everybody's point, it's more about what you see than what you hear. And I always tell my clients, it's really best to listen with your eyes. Observe what's going on, be observant. Sitting in a business meeting in Asia, and you look at people that you're presenting to, the Asian culture, there's a lot of eye contact going on between them. And you need to be able to read those eyes. Are those eyes, eyes of disapproval? Are those eyes ones of acknowledgement? Are they happy with what they're hearing? And once you get used to that, you definitely can maneuver your own presentations to fit what they want and take it all away. Now, I see there's a question about post-COVID. In Asia, think about it. Everybody was bowing forever. Nobody really ever shook hands before the Western influence came in. As a matter of fact, where I lived in Japan, which was in Hokkaido, there were very few Americans there. So nobody ever shook hands. Maybe that's the way to go post-COVID. I mean, I see a lot of people elbow bumping, but, I think that perhaps we're going to have to definitely address the way we do business moving forward with an initial interaction with someone. You could probably see people backing up, and still some of the Asian cultures don't accept a handshake. I mean, I've been in meetings where some people came to shake my hand and others just immediately put their hands to their side and did a bow. So who knows, maybe that's the way it's going to go. But I think it's really too early to tell, because business travel has not gone back to where it was.
Yeah, and I also think it's COVID or no COVID. Some people are huggers, some people are not huggers, some people are very much about their personal space. So I think it's a matter of being respectful now and, just understanding it. Instead of automatically shaking someone's hand, it's, do you mind if I shake your hands to say hello? I think it's going to be that sort of thing. It's like when you jump into an elevator at the moment. I know in my building, I ask people, some say yes, some say no, and that's okay. So I think it's going to be a new level of respect, and it is what it is, and we move on. Because
I think the effect that COVID has had on various parts of the world has been a fantastic showcase of cultures, because the different cultures and the way that people, as we say, greet each other, or the fact that some cultures are very collectivist cultures, they think automatically of the community rather than the more individualistic cultures in the West, have all impacted on the way that we've dealt with the COVID. And in some respects, certain cultures have done themselves no favors simply by the way they are, and the fact that they enjoy a lot of contact and kissing, or that they're very individualistic and very conscious of their own rights as an individual, have affected people's handling of the COVID. And it's a fascinating, I mean, there'll be books and books on how cultures have affected the way that COVID has affected certain societies.
And I think it goes back to what we were originally talking about, knowing the culture, because even, some cultures will shake hands with men and not with men won't shake hands with women. Or, so it's very important too that we do our research. And to your point, Richard, I was just thinking, oh, that'd be a great book to write about how to move forward, doing business period after post COVID.
Yeah. It just elevates how respectful we have to be of our personal space more than what we were previously, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to shift gears and we're going to get to the business end of it. So, as you think about presenting a business opportunity, how have you seen this done differently across different markets? What has worked well and where have you thought, this is not going well? And I think it's quite fitting because some of you own your own businesses and consulting arms and you need to sort of have that approach. So Richard, let's focus on you for a little bit.
Yeah, well, let me give you an example. Suppose I'm a salesperson and I'm trying to sell a travel management program, either to some external customers as a TMC or to some internal stakeholders. And I'm going to go back to my old reference here of the low and high context. If I'm addressing a low context culture, so maybe a German or a Dane, I need to go straight to the detail. I need to have plenty of analytics. I need to be prepared, as Shelley was, for in-depth questioning almost throughout, because it is about the details. It's not so much about anything else. If I'm selling perhaps the same thing to an American audience, then I would be more about the big vision, the seamless experience for travelers. I would be talking about a great idea of efficiency and a big picture, and because that is more of a high context culture in this context, and the details I would probably leave in the footnotes, really, almost, and actually may not even get to them at all in some meetings, because I'd be more about talking about the big picture. If I was selling to a Chinese person or a Korean or a Japanese, I'd probably step back even further and talk about a long-term relationship, a big vision. Maybe I would talk about that with different people than actually the people who would be getting into the details. So another step back, but very much about the bigger picture and the long-term relationship that our two companies might have. And that's an example of the spectrum of context, of high and low context. So that's how I would vary it.
Nice one, Shelley.
Yeah, just building on that, again, couldn't agree more. I think knowing when to dive into the detail and when to step back is critical, because you can very easily trip yourself up and lose your audience by taking the wrong approach. And this is where, going back to our very first question about doing business at their pace, not your pace, is really critical. I think it's also important to consider when you need to be the expert versus when you need to bring in an expert. And we've had this with several clients that we've worked with, where actually they just want a relationship with one person, one salesperson or a small sales team, and they want those people to be the ones who are in front of them every time and presenting the solution. For other clients, they actually want to see the breadth and depth of expertise that the company has to offer. So sometimes you as the lead need to take a step back and bring in a subject matter expert to take the lead on being that expert in that environment. But it's about understanding what the client wants and when that's relevant. So again, if we're looking at the UK and the US market, generally speaking, it's more about having one person lead the conversation at a higher level, and then at the right time, diving into more detail around a workshop. For other clients, I've recently done some work with clients in India and Israel, and they again want to know that you have experts who can answer their questions. So they don't want to be in a position where you're there as the face of it, but actually you have to go and ask somebody else for the really detailed, in-depth answer to their question. So being prepared to bring in experts when necessary is a key piece for me.
Yeah, and it's knowing your audience, what they'll want to know as well. And that's, I think, quite universal, no matter where you sit. Talk us through your experience, Lenore.
Yeah, so I think it would be remiss of me not to mention the fact that, particularly when you're doing business in Asia, I mean, I believe this is true always, but, when you go in as a group and you're presenting to your clients, whether it be in Asia or Europe or anywhere, you need to have that solidarity with your group, right? But the Japanese culture demands that. They don't look at individuals. So if there is a dominant personality within your group, it's really critical to make sure that everyone in your group that's presenting is even. Everyone has to, make sure that you're on the same page, you speak at the same pace, you don't get very animated if that's what the culture calls for or doesn't call for. So, presenting that solidarity is really very critical when you're going in, and particularly in the Japanese culture, they look at that. If they almost look at it, I've been told that they will look at it as you're not unified, and you can't be trusted if you don't work as a group. So the whole point is, when you go in as a group, make sure that everybody's on the same page in your group, make sure that you all have the same goal, the same roadmap to get to that goal, and that you present it accordingly. And the other thing is too, I've noticed that, in the Asian culture, like a hard sell does not work. Be very factual when you go in, have your P's and Q's, your dot all your I's, cross all your T's, make sure that you can have supporting documentation for whatever information you're giving, because in the US, in particular, I think we're very relationship driven, right? We build a relationship, and that helps us along the way. Obviously, we have to, provide the products that our clients are looking for, but we are very relationship driven. People buy from people they trust, is, this whole thing. But and I think that's true everywhere, but more importantly, in the Asian culture, it's the facts, it's the numbers, it's, what product are you selling? And by delivering that in a unified way and understanding what it is that they need, then you'll build the trust, as opposed to here in the US, where you build the trust first and then you get the opportunity to present what you need.
Great points. Thank you, Lenore. So finally, we're going to start looking back at when you first started working overseas, sharing your personal lessons that you reflect on how you worked with colleagues, similar to what you would, tell your 21-year-old self scenario. So help us understand that piece as we close off. Lenore, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, well, gee, I have so many, because I went to Japan at such a young age, straight out of Brooklyn. And wow. One of the things, again, I did take the time before I went. I knew I was going. I had 3 or 4 months to learn things, and I learned the language, and I thought I learned the cultures. Remember back in those, well, not remember, but just so you know, back in those days, there was no internet. I had to go for the books. And God only knows when some of those books were written. But some of the things that they never taught me in those books was, about food, and about, going out afterwards for a business dinner, and where do they go and what do they do. So I was a vegetarian, and I was invited to go to a Korean restaurant for dinner. And one of the biggest delicacies that they have is raw beef with apples and garlic. And so I was with the CEO of this company, and he's telling me, oh, here, this is a delicacy you must try. And I was like, well, I'm a vegetarian, I said. And I didn't know how to say that in Japanese at the time, but I was like, I don't eat meat, I can't do it. And it was like one of those Western films where somebody walks into a bar and the whole bar goes dead silent. Everybody stopped talking and just looked at me. And I was like, oh my God, what did I do? Well, to make a long story short, I was told that I had to eat the beef. It was rude not to eat the beef. And so it's really important, if you can, and you know what, to Shelley's point, reach out to someone who's been there before. If I had that opportunity, it would have been great, because those are things that I might have learned. The little things that you won't find in a book, can go a long way. So reach out to your resources. They have firsthand experience. They can tell you these little things that to us, it wouldn't matter, because if somebody told me they didn't want to eat my pasta, well, I think they were crazy. But if they didn't want to eat my pasta, I wouldn't get insulted. I would understand. But in certain cultures, you just can't do that.
I have to ask you, what did you do?
I ate it.
You ate it?
I did. I ate it. And I don't want to tell you about the rest of the night.
Okay, no worries.
I had a similar experience, Lenore, when I was in China. And I was trying to get close to a partner airline in China, and he invited me out for lunch, and that is a great sign of a relationship moving to another level. And on top of that, he took me to a restaurant that specialized in the cuisine from his home province. Again, another big tick. And then we got to the restaurant. He selected the dishes that his mum used to make him when he was a child. Another enormous tick. Well, I don't know whether he was testing me, but what arrived on the table was a horror show. I think the lowest point was it was called chilled jello worms, which literally were worms set in chilled jelly, or jello, as you'd say in the US. Now, that was great, and I had to eat it just like Lenore. I just had to get on with it. But I didn't know whether it was just another cultural experience, or whether he was testing me, and whether he was seeing whether I was serious about this relationship. And sometimes there's an ulterior motive, but it's very important, as Lenore quite rightly says, you just got to get on with it if you can.
I love that. Something, Richard, you mentioned in your notes, which I'm going to share with the group, is you spoke about learn not to confuse your company culture versus national culture.
Yeah. Well, that is the first thing that I would recommend to my 21-year-old self. And I had a situation where when I was living in Sweden, I was running BA for Scandinavia. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if we had some annual awards where we'd award the best airport manager, the best sales manager, just basically as a bit of a motivational piece. Well, very quickly, I had a delegation in my office saying that this really wasn't the way that they did things in Scandinavia, that it wasn't right to just put a spotlight on one individual when, in fact, it was everybody who was pulling together to create the result. And I, unprepared for this, basically said, well, this is the way that we do things at British Airways. What I was actually saying was, and that's how they took it, was actually this is the way we do things in Britain. And it was such a big mistake, because actually I was confusing national culture, company culture, and I was totally ignoring what was going to work in Scandinavia. Needless to say, those awards lasted 1 year.
Surprised you got them even kicked off.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that would be the first thing that I would recommend. Be careful that you don't masquerade company culture as actually trying to import your own national culture. The other thing as well is that I wish I'd been more clever in actually appreciating the relevance of cultural intelligence. So obviously, when I moved to China, I knew that I needed to have some cultural training. It was obvious. I mean, most people would get that. Moving to Sweden, I had none, and that wasn't clever, because actually, as I've said, there were some big cultural differences that would have really helped me. But what I really wish I had done, and something that I would really encourage everybody to do, is to think about, when you're managing a team across the globe from your home office here in the UK or in the US, you don't have to be in country to need to understand, the cultural attributes of members of your team. And even more so, if all these people are located in your office in a city like London, the chances are you're going to have people of a whole variety of cultures. Thinking about actually how do you get the best out of your people by understanding some of the angles at which they come to work, and not just saying, well, they're all going to be fitting into the British stereotype because they happen to be located in Britain. So I would have probably appreciated a wider application of cultural intelligence rather than the most obvious ones, which are if one's going to the Far East to work for 4 years.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I love the story about the employee of the month. Moving on to Shelley.
Yeah, so a couple of things from me, and actually my first international role was when I was 21, and
Yeah.
I do wish that I had had somebody tap me on the shoulder and give me some hints and tips, because I certainly went in very naive and not really understanding the nuances that I would face. So I think my biggest mistake was probably thinking too much about stereotypes and not really understanding those nuances and cultural differences. In my first overseas role, I worked a lot with German, Dutch, and Belgian tour operators. And there were some very distinct differences between those three groups. And I think, again, I went in assuming that they're all part of Europe, they're all neighbours, they'll all be very similar. And they just weren't. So understanding those nuances. And I think if somebody again had tapped me on the shoulder and said, just don't be afraid to ask. Don't be afraid to show a bit of vulnerability. I think that goes a long way to show that you're open to learning, to show that you want to do the right thing. And maybe you don't know. And it's okay to say, I'm really sorry, I don't want to offend you. I just want to check. And I think that's fine. Don't be afraid to be vulnerable and to ask that. And the final thing I think that I learned, and I can still be guilty of this today, particularly when I get excited, I can talk very, very quickly. And for many of us, we're dealing with people for whom English is a second language. And we forget this. We really forget it because they all speak English so well when we're interacting with colleagues from different cultures. So being aware of your pace when you're talking and the words that you use, anything that's very typical of where you're from may not translate well. And actually that works between US and UK, British English, American English. There are some differences in the way that we say things, and some things mean different things. So just considering that the people you're talking to might have to listen extra hard to understand what you're saying, to just slow down your pace and consider simplifying your message.
Yeah, and I always think, to your point, when you show that ignorance, but you also want to learn, they like that you want to learn about their culture and their way. And before you know it, it sort of elevates the relationship even more, I find, because you are showing that you care and you are being respectful of the differences. Absolutely. So we have one question left in the chat. It talks about, in this Zoom world, what are your thoughts? My opinion is, yeah, it's a bit difficult. There's certain people that you will deal with that you can't really have a icebreaker game at the start. It just won't. It won't go very well. It's not what the cultures do. So I think we just need to learn to be patient. We need to engage in conversation we know is relevant, and that will help with that relationship building as much as we can through the screens, because that's all we can do for now. And then the fun can come when we feel we are there as such. Anybody else have any opinion on that?
I would say that the Zoom environment, the sort of virtual present environment, sort of lends itself better to sort of low context cultures where it's about words rather than so much about the music and the dance. I think if I had to build the relationships that I had to build when I was in Beijing with the Chinese government over Zoom, I think I would have very quickly ground to a halt. I mean, it just would not have worked, because you just don't get that, that context and the sort of the before and after meeting type of chat that helps to build relationships in the way that they're needed in that part of the world. So I mean, I run courses on how to be a better Zoomer, so how to make great TV for yourself, which essentially is what Zoom is. And one of the things as well is that for people who are very demonstrative with their hands, and you can see that I am, and I imagine Lenore, being an Italian American, is also, this is torture, because most of the time you can only see up to here. So we're channeling so much more energy through a sort of tight hole, and it's torture for people like me, but we make the most of it.
Yeah, and we know this is not forever. I think as an industry, or just as a global community, we know that this is temporary. There are certain things that, yes, we can shift onto Zoom within your business, but there are certain things you just need to get in front of people for. So I don't think this is going to be the norm forever.
Well, back when we had, I don't remember, I think it was after 9/11, and Richard, you may remember this, British Airways actually conducted an experiment and an effort to try to get people back face to face, right? And being comfortable with it. Because if you remember back then, Zoom wasn't here, and the webinars that they had, like, they were crashing. I mean, we weren't ready for it. So British Airways conducted this experiment, and it was called Face to Face. Richard, do you remember that?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
And I was part of that. And what they did was they flew us all over from the US. They flew us from JFK into London, and we were all travel people. And I think there might have been some other from other industries as well. But the whole point of it was to see if during the short time period that we flew from New York to London, and then B, had a dinner together, how much business we generated as opposed to what we were generating on these very immature visual ways to do it, online ways to do it. And I believe that they proved at that point, and they might have done a paper on it actually, of how we had to report how many, if we made any sales or if we just made contacts. And they proved that, in-person business is so much more effective.
Yeah.
So that was just something that happened back then I thought I'd bring out.
I think the other thing with Zoom, and I'm a big fan of camera on. I think it makes a huge difference. It's so hard to build a relationship through these digital channels anyway. It's almost impossible when people are not on camera. And I think what these virtual tools have enabled us to do is get a sneak peek into people's lives almost. You can see that everybody is having to work from different rooms of their house, be it their kitchen, or if they're lucky and they have an office, or a corner of their bedroom, or wherever it might be. You can get a bit of a snapshot into people's lives, and actually that can help build the relationship because people are more open to sharing a little bit more about themselves. I think you can see a noted difference when people have a corporate background applied to their Zoom versus when they just have their standard background applied to their Zoom. And the amount of calls I've been on with clients where they've had a bookcase behind them or a picture of their kids and they want to talk about it, or their kids have done a picture, it just opens up more communication, I think. So I would love to be face-to-face, and I'm desperate for the time when we can get back to face-to-face. But I think there are ways in which we can use these digital tools to build relationships. It's never going to be the same as being in a room with somebody, but I think we can find ways of making it more engaging.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Shelley. And to be honest with you, the business travel world depends on people making that case and understanding that moving forward. I like to think of Zoom as being a replacement for the telephone rather than from the face-to-face meeting, and I think that's how it's going to add value. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's such an important aspect of what we do.
Agreed.
I wanted to say a huge thank you to our guest speakers. Your wise words of wisdom have been amazing. In summary, I feel that it's universal. I wanted to share some final points for people to think about, for those that are taking notes out there. Number one, a long-term relationship will really come down to trust, whether you're doing business internationally or locally. It's about behaving credibly, being honest, being transparent, setting the right expectations, as we've spoken about, and listening and adapting. I think adapting, as you saw in this call, was a big topic. Knowing what matters most to your stakeholders, making sure you communicate and keep in touch, especially now since, a lot of us haven't been on a plane in a year. We usually may do 2 or 3 trips. Send a note, pick up the phone, just keep in touch. Share knowledge that will help your partnership succeed. Make sure you learn and embrace their culture. Have a meal together. That's personally one of my favorites, to learn about their different culture, their different food, and just taste different amazing things. Network well, find common ground. But I think most importantly, which we've hopefully highlighted through this session today, is really respect everybody's differences. On a final note, the recorded version of today's session will be on the TAMS website. I really hope you've enjoyed our conversation. I certainly have, and don't forget to check out the TAMS website. The details are in the chat. Take care and stay well, everybody. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.